Hello. On behalf of Crosstex, a Cantel medical company, I'd like to welcome you to the Luminary Insights to Sterility Assurance, the top 10 myths and realities. The goal of sterile processing is to ensure that the sterility of the critical patient care items is achieved and that it's going to be maintained until ready to be used. There's a lot of different conditions, behaviors, and events that can challenge the sterilization process, and it can also compromise the integrity of sterile goods and packaging. So tonight we're going to be talking about a few of these. My name is Leanne Kiefer. I'm Director of Clinical Services and Education for Crosstex. So what are some of the suggestions for better instrument care? We invest a lot of money in our dental equipment, and we want to make sure that we're taking care of it appropriately and also making sure that our patients are safe. So by gaining a better understanding of instrument care, we hope to help you reduce costs, allow for more efficient instrument processing, and as I said, help to improve patient safety. We need to remember that better instrument care begins with having the necessary cleaning tools and the equipment, from something as simple as cleaning brushes and spray-on enzyme foam or lubricant, as well as an ultrasonic unit, washer disinfectors, and of course our sterilizers. Even things like proper lighting in our sterilization area, particularly in the decontamination and prep and pack, will help to ensure proper instrument processing, that we don't have any leftover bioburden that we're baking on with sterilization. And when it comes to buying new instruments, purchasing high-quality instruments as well as the packaging materials or sterilization materials that you're using with them, providing continuous education, ongoing education with the staff for the proper processing and use of the devices. That's going to include proper care and handling of those instruments as well. This is a quote from Chuck Hughes, who made the statement that proper instrument processing is a critical aspect of infection control because behind every instrument is a patient. And when instruments and other dental supplies are not properly cleaned, disinfected, or sterilized, there's a definite risk of exposure to harmful microorganisms. So now more than ever, the commitment to our infection prevention and compliance. And compliance is the big word. This was one of the reasons behind the CDC summary document, the Summary of Infection Prevention Practices in Dental Care Settings, that was released in 2016. Because while we've not really had any new evidence base to change the CDC guidelines that were published in 2003, what we found out was that compliance is where we were lacking. And so the summary document gives us a more user-friendly document to be able to follow through. We also know that our patients trust and they expect that the delivery of the care that we're offering to be safe. And it's in these moments when no one else is watching that we need to make sure that we're staying on a comprehensive sterility assurance program. I want to remind you of a study that was done by the CDC in 2009 with more than 3,000 respondents, and they got about a 65% response rate on this infection control survey, which is pretty impressive. However, some of the resulting numbers were a little disconcerting because they looked at infection control practices. They looked at 4 main ones to find out how many of the practices were complying with 1, 2, 3, or 4 of these basic practices. And this survey reported that only 26%, a little over a quarter, had implemented 3 of the 4 infection control practices, while 34% of the practices had implemented 1 to none. So my goal with our webinar time tonight is that we're going to take the necessary steps to avoid any type of an infection control breach that can put your practice in the headlines. So let's talk about the term best practice. Best practice is considered to be a method or a technique that has been generally accepted as superior to anything else because it produces results that are better, superior to those by other means. It's sort of become a standard way of doing things, a standard way of complying with clinical or legal or ethical requirements. And best practices are often set forth by an authority. such as a governing body or management, depending upon the circumstances behind it. And while best practice generally dictate the recommended course of actions, some situations require that industry best practices also be followed. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between best and common practice. So these are some of the questions that you might want to ask yourself about the best practices within your organization. So what's the criteria? How are you documenting it? What's the difference between common practice or current practice compared to what is best practice? How are you communicating these methods, these preferences for superior techniques and methods to be able to be consistent amongst your office? And so what steps do we need to make sure that compliance and execution of best practices is practiced continually and ongoing? So the terms, best practice, common practice, current practice. I also sometimes refer to this as the common practice is tribal learning, because often I speak with clinicians on the phone or at lectures, and they will tell me they're doing a certain procedure a certain way, and when I ask them, why are you following that method? And the answer I get sometimes is, well, when I started here, that's how Sue told me to do it. And so we have to make sure that we're looking to the right standards so that we are in compliance. And so sometimes we assume that having the knowledge sharing and the best practices is going to happen organically, that it's going to just be transmitted from one person in the practice to another, but it doesn't. We have obstacles that we face that prevent best practices sometimes from being adopted. Obviously, we talked about this common practice where we've just always done it that way, and we've not looked at what's the science behind and is there something we could do better. Also, sometimes, we think that best practices are just going to naturally become a standard. It takes actually longer to break a bad habit than it does to start a new habit. You can start a new habit and get it to stick in about 14 days. But sometimes you have to break that bad habit first, or that common practice first, and that takes about 21 days. So it takes a lot of focus. Right now, what we look to as our authority in dentistry for best practices in sterility assurance is the CDC. And the CDC document that was issued for infection control practice in dental healthcare settings in 2003 is still a valid document. And then, as I mentioned, the summary document that you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen gives more of the user-friendly approach for those guidelines. The other thing that I think really helps with best practice in this document is toward the end of the book, and it's the two appendices at the end of the book, and these are two checklists. The first checklist is an administrative checklist that you would use to see if your policies and procedures that are written in your infection control manual are in fact compliant with the CDC guidelines. And I found it interesting when I looked at this, there's 8 different sections within each one of the checklists. And the sterilization and disinfection of patient care items and devices actually has 3 dedicated pages. So this is a tremendous resource, not only from the administrative side, but there's a second checklist that is from the observation side that can be used as a teachable moment with the team. And these are simply yes/no questions that review the guidelines. If you've not seen this document, I would encourage you to go to the CDC website, or you can also go to the osap.org, osap.org website. It's a little bit easier to find it, and then you can download the document, both documents as a matter of fact. I'm going to mention one other document since we're talking about sterilization, and this is the AAMI document, the Standard 79, that's considered to be the comprehensive guide, aka the Bible, to steam sterilization in healthcare facilities. This is what Joint Commission is going to look at when they're evaluating healthcare facilities, and that may include dental practices or dental clinics that are part of a community health clinic. So it's important to be aware of this reference. It was again developed by industry experts and regulators, and it covers every aspect from design all the way through to the instrument reprocessing and procedure. The one thing that makes it a little bit of a challenge is that this document is not available complimentary like the CDC documents. This is a for purchase document through Amy, and the purchase price is right around $400. But I just think you need to be aware that it does exist. So now that we know that best practices are based on evidence-based science, what do we as users need to be able to comply with the guidelines that we've been given? One of the things that I think is a challenge in a number of practices that I've had the opportunity to speak with is the appropriate documentation and use of manufacturers' IFUs, or instructions for use. The CDC guidelines outline that you need to have copies of the IFU for every instrument, device, piece of equipment, chemical, anything that you're using in your practice for patient care. You need to have the valid IFU as part of your overall documentation. You can either have it as a hard copy like in a binder, or you can scan them and upload them to make it for an electronic file. But you don't necessarily want to depend on going online to do a search, because sometimes you may not be able to access the internet, and so you'd want to have it downloaded to your hard drive. You also want to make sure that on your products that you have all the technical data, the validation documents, the certification documents, as well as the outlined intended use documents. I would also encourage you, when you are going through your annual review of your products, especially your infection control products, that you set a list of standard criteria for each of the main items that you want to see how your current product sort of measures up to those standard criteria. And if there's been a change in your practice and you want to look at alternative products, then you have something to compare it to. I would also encourage you to have the customer service and support information, the phone numbers or the email for all the products, so that when you need them in time where it's a little stressful, you don't have to go searching for them. So that's another good thing to keep along with the IFUs. When you change to new products and you have to figure out, like the reprocessing instructions are included on items on their IFUs. If they are not reprocessing, meaning how to clean, disinfect, and or sterilize, then that item is considered a single-use product and it cannot be reprocessed. So when you do these, you want to have those IFUs available, and the in-service can either come from, sometimes it comes from the rep of the company that you've worked with. Sometimes the companies will provide online education about product information. But I would not say that this is a one and done type of situation, especially with sterility assurance. If you have any kind of turnover or you add new staff, you want to make sure that there is ongoing training available, and then as well as the annual training for your specific protocols and practices. So the user responsibility. We know what we need, but what are we responsible for? We have to understand how all of our sterilization technology, whether it's pieces of equipment or devices, or whether it is the disposable products that we're using like wrap or tape or chemical indicators, we need to know how they're to be used, how they're to be interpreted, how they're to be maintained, what are the most common errors and how are they corrected, as well as what are the CDC guidelines for how those products are to be used. We want to make sure that these supplies are compatible with the type of sterilization technology that we each have in our offices. Now in dentistry, we're pretty lucky because the vast majority of offices use steam sterilization in one form or another. They're either going to use the very traditional gravity displacement sterilizer, or they may be using a dynamic air, which would be like a pre-vac or a Class B sterilizer, or the steam flush pressure pulse, SFPP. And you want to make sure that the products that you're using are going to be compatible with the equipment that they're being used in. You also want to think about how packaging materials affect sterilization parameters, because if we're not using the materials correctly, we may get misinformation about how that product fared during sterilization. So we do need, even though you think a pouch is a pouch, you want to make sure that you know how that pouch is supposed to be used, and for example, how that manufacturer says the pouch, for example, should be placed in a sterilizer. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go forward. We talked about the C of A, certificate of analysis, the validation, and remember, if a product has been validated a specific way that it's used, that's how it got the outcome, the performance for the product. So let's say that a product says you're supposed to use 2 layers of sterilization wrap, and that's what guarantees these outcome measures. Well, if you opt to go off-label, remember, this is an FDA approved device, or cleared device. If you opt to go off-label, then you're not using it the way it was supposed to, so you cannot expect the same type of outcomes. So that's why these IFUs and all the technical data is so very, very important. And while we have this plethora of resources from the CDC, from our manufacturer vendors, we also need to develop, implement, and enforce those policies and procedures in our own practices. So those type of things like, how do you load your sterilizer? What temperatures are you running wrapped instruments at? All those things should be in your infection control manual as well. This is always just a good review, because the way we decide how we are going to treat our instruments is based on the level of risk. And this is the Spaulding's classification that was developed in 1968, and it's still viable today. It's not used only in dentistry, but also medicine, veterinary, etc. And what they're looking at is for an item to be critical, that item is going to penetrate the mucus, the soft tissue membranes, and there will be an exposure to the vascular system, the blood supply. And since most of our instruments in dentistry tend to be sort of sharp, the vast majority of our instruments fall into that critical level, and those must be heat sterilized. It's not they should be, or it would be nice if you did. It's they must be heat sterilized. Now, semi-critical instruments, this is where it gets a little confusing for people sometimes, because there's not that many in dentistry. These are things that just touch the mucous membranes. So examples of those would be a mirror, an amalgam condenser, a face bow for a rubber dam frame. Those would all be semi-critical items. And the CDC is very clear that they say if that semi-critical item can be heat sterilized, if it is heat tolerant, then it should be heat sterilized. If it cannot be heat sterilized, the second option is going to be a single-use disposable would be your next level go-to. If a single-use disposable is not available, then and only then would a high-level disinfection, meaning an immersion to chemical, be acceptable for semi-critical items. Hand pieces, this is one of those unique parts. Hand pieces fall into this category. However, I'm sure you're all very aware of the CDC and the FDA, the changes in 2014, that all hand pieces, whether they are a high-speed, a low-speed motor, a hygiene hand piece, a prophy hand piece, whatever you want to call it, those all need to be heat sterilized after each patient. If you happen to have a handpiece around your office that's been there for a while and it's still a workhorse, but it does not have reprocessing instructions on the IFU, that handpiece needs to be taken out of service. You cannot be using that handpiece and be in compliance with CDC guidelines. Finally, last but not least, are the non-critical items. These just contact the skin but not the mucous membranes. So that would be things like a pulse oximeter, a blood pressure cuff, the x-ray head. These just need to be surface disinfected with a low or intermediate level disinfectant. So now we've sort of given you the overall view of what we're going to be talking about with best practices in instrument processing, and essentially we're going to be looking at 3 areas. We're going to start at the point of use in the treatment room. We're then going to move to our sterilization or our reprocessing area, where we will clean, disinfect, assemble, package, and sterilize in that area. And then last but not least, with dentistry, sometimes the sterile storage area is usually not in the reprocessing area. There's simply not enough space, so that tends to be in our individual treatment rooms, but we will also discuss the quality assurance and quality control steps as well. So this is our first common practice. Again, not best practice, but either common or current practice, and that's the act of transporting contaminated or soil instruments to the reprocessing area using an open tray. That's not within the CDC guidelines. It is important that we transport contaminated instruments in a sealed, leak-proof, puncture-proof container, and it needs to be labeled with the biohazard symbol. These do not have to be specific, medical devices that you're going to be buying from a dealer. You can actually go to a big box store and you can purchase, like a Sterilite or a Rubbermaid or a Tupperware, and those can be used as your transport as long as it has a secure snap-on lid. If the lid is red, all the better. If it's not red, you want to make sure that you have a biohazard symbol on there because there are contaminated instruments in there. It's also a great idea to have at least 2 boxes for each treatment room so that you can keep the rotation going. And obviously those boxes need to be decontaminated periodically throughout the day as well as at the end of the day. And I know we're all, crazy busy trying to keep with our schedule going, and if you have the instruments in your transport container and it's going to be a while before they're going to be processed through the ultrasonic or the washer disinfector, you want to make sure that you're doing a best practice of using an enzymatic solution, detergent, or foam that's going to help to keep those proteinaceous materials moist, so it's much easier for the cleaning devices to actually work. So this just shows you an example of what one of these might look like. In the hygiene area, a shoebox size one may be adequate. But if you're into some of the more complex restorative instrument packages, you may need a little bit bigger box. I usually also get the question or the statement that, Leanne, we use cassettes, so we're fine. We can transport in the cassette. Problem is, the cassette is not leak-proof. Obviously, it has to have the venting to allow the sterilant to be able to penetrate. So yes, cassettes have to go into a transport container as well. All right, common practice number 2. We're going to clean all the instruments the same way using the same method. We're just going to push the button and go. This is again where your IFUs come into play. The IFUs for the individual instruments, as well as the IFUs for your sterilizer, as well as the IFUs for the packaging material that you're using. Think about the different designs and densities and complexities of a restorative or a surgical instrument compared to a dental hygiene scaling instrument. Therefore, the processing that needs to happen may be very different from item to item. So you want to separate your clean your instruments based on the IFUs, and it's going to tell you a validated method for cleaning. It's going to tell you what type of water you can use, whether it can be straight tap water or if you need to use treated water. I personally live in Colorado, and we have a very high mineral content in our water, and so many of our dental offices choose to do a filtration. This is not the dental unit water line treatment. This is filtering the water that's coming into their faucets, because the high mineral content sometimes plays havoc with rinsing of their instruments. You also need to look, if you are using any type of brush on your instruments, you want to make sure that it's compatible, as well as the detergent type that you're going to be using in your ultrasonic or your instrument washer. Using an over-the-counter product, you cannot use a dishwasher soap in your washer disinfector. It's a medical device, and it requires a specific type of neutral or alkaline detergent to be used in there. And when you're going through and thinking about replacing instruments, maybe before you even buy the instrument is to request a copy of the IFU for that instrument to make sure that you have all the resources and knowledge necessary to be able to process that particular instrument as well. And I think we've already talked about the IFUs. Water temperature is also important. You want to keep more of a mild to warm water. You don't want to use cold and you don't want to use hot, because that can also set some of the protein on your instruments. So you're better off using a lukewarm water out of the faucet. On brushes, obviously the CDC is not recommending manual instrumentation brushing as a primary method of cleaning. You're better off with a mechanical method, whether it's ultrasonic or washer disinfector, because it's much more efficient. It's also safer. But if you are going to use some brushes in your office, you need to make sure that that brush is compatible with that instrument. Obviously, like the metal brush that you're seeing on the right, that used to be used for burr brushes, but now we know that burrs, for the most part, are considered a single-use disposable because all the nooks and crannies cannot be appropriately cleaned. But when you start seeing a brush that looks like you stood on it, it's time to replace that brush. If you do have any brushes for instruments, they should be the long-handled brushes like you see on the left. They should not look like a nail or a hand brush that you would commonly use, because you're going to have a higher chance of an accidental percutaneous injury. Make sure that you do disinfect or sterilize reusable brushes. Read the IFUs before you put a brush with a plastic body in your sterilizer. You don't know that they all are compatible with steam sterilization. And now we're looking at common practice number 3, placing instruments into an ultrasonic cleaner for a short period of time and or without a lid, or adding instruments after a cycle has already begun. Those are all considered tribal practices, and they are not within the IFU. So you want to make sure that you're keeping your ultrasonic filled to the appropriate fill line, so the instruments are going to be adequately covered. You'll want to run the cycle for the appropriate amount of time with the right amount or weight of instruments in the basket. And never, never, never run an ultrasonic cleaner without a lid on it. There have been anecdotal studies that found that ultrasonics in dental practices, the tabletop units, even the countertop submerged units, can generate a contaminated aerosol 6 to 8 feet if they are run without a lid. So for the safety of yourselves and all of your teammates, please always put a lid on there. There's different schools of thought about how frequently the ultrasonic solution needs to be changed. What I'm seeing more often now with the ultrasonic companies, the manufacturers, they're saying twice a day, minimum absolutely once a day. You also want to make sure that you're cleaning the tank itself, the interior of the tank, after you've emptied out the other solution. Be careful not to use any type of sprays in that tank, because you may have some chemicals left over that would react with the enzymatic detergent for the ultrasonic, so don't mix and match your chemicals. Last but not least, we want to take the time to rinse our instruments after they come out of the ultrasonic. You know, sometimes we turn on the faucet and we do the quick 1-2 swish swish and we dump them out, and then we wonder why our instruments are getting the brown little pits on them, and it's because the enzymatic detergent was not adequately rinsed and you've essentially baked it on your instrument. So minimum of 30 seconds before you're good to go. Speaking of ultrasonics, these are my 2 public service announcements to deal with ultrasonic units. You want to make sure that you're following your IFUs for ultrasonic testing to make sure that your unit is functioning appropriately. The traditional foil test using household aluminum foil, not the heavy duty like we use at the holidays, but traditional foil. You want to make sure that it does not touch the bottom or the sides of the tank when you're holding it suspended. And obviously you're going to do this only when you have new solution in the tank. You don't want to do it with dirty solution because you can't put the lid on it. And you'll let it run for 20 to 60 seconds depending upon that acronym, the IFUs. And what you want to see is a picture like the left one on the bottom, where it looks like a cobblestone or pebbled evenly all the way across where it was submerged in the fluid. You may even see some pinprick holes, and that's okay. What you don't want to see is more than a ½ an inch that's smooth or without any indentation, because that's probably a pretty good indicator that there's something going on with your transducer, and the cavitation is not working appropriately. The other thing to look at, this is sort of the newer, one of the newer methods. There are ultrasonic disposable tests that are available from a number of manufacturers right now. Those can also be used. But I know in Canada, they are using the glass slide. And what they're recommending is it's frosted on one end, and you dip the glass slide in water to get it moist. Then you take a number 2 graphite pencil and you mark an X on the frosted end of the slide, and then you dip the frosted end into the ultrasonic solution. You run it for about a period of 10 seconds, and all of that graphite should in fact be removed at the end of that cycle. You should be testing your ultrasonic minimally once a month. Bi-monthly is a really good idea, twice a month. This is something that I will be honest, I learned since I came to my position with the company I'm with right now. I had never heard about degassing with the ultrasonic solution. What that does is it removes the small suspended gas bubbles that sometimes happen when you're putting new solution into the tank. So you only need to do this when you're putting in new solution. The reason you want to get rid of those little gas bubbles is because what they do is they migrate to the cavitation bubbles, and it prevents the cavitation bubbles from imploding on themselves, and that's what loosens the debris on your instruments. So if you have extra gas bubbles in the solution, your cavitation is not going to be as efficient. Think of the gas, it's like an airbag in your car, so it prevents it from contacting. So do the degassing approximately for 10 to 15 minutes. So you put the new solution in, you put the lid on, you run it for 10 to 15 minutes depending upon your manufacturer's IFUs, and then you're good to go. Common practice number 4 is using only a single sheet of sterilization wrap to package our instrument cassettes. The CDC and AMI are very clear, as are the manufacturer's IFUs of these disposable surgical sheets, that we need to use 2 sheets to protect the instruments from becoming contaminated, especially during storage and handling. A simple way to think of it is, you know, that crepe paper is not as sturdy as maybe the paper that's on our pouches or the laminate. And if somehow the outer packaging gets punctured or torn, the inner packaging still is not compromised, so you wouldn't have to re-sterilize the entire cassette. Now I also, while this picture's up, I want you to take a look at the tape on this method. This is an envelope fold that they've done. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's an envelope fold. But you see that there are 3 pieces of tape. I've got into practices and I see where it looks like they've taken the roll of tape and wrapped it all the way around the cassette trying to get it, you know, to hold. The size of the tape piece should be about 4 inches in length for the average dental and dental hygiene cassettes. And so you're going to put 2 pieces at the end to hold the end pieces, and then 1 piece across the middle. So again, 4 inches, not a tiny little, you know, 1-inch piece of tape. You need to use the whole 4 inches, because remember, that is going to be put under pressure and steam, and if you don't have it secured well, that's going to pop up and it's not going to be sealed. Do remember that our sterilization materials are considered to be Class 2 medical devices by the FDA. So it means if it's a pouch, if it's a cassette, if it's wrap, if it's an indicator, it's a Class 2 medical device. And in particular to pouches and surgical wrap, part of the 510K with the FDA said not only is that wrap intended to allow the sterilant to penetrate through the materials and expose the instruments that are inside, it's also there to maintain the sterility of the enclosed device until it's used. So when we do things like sterilize unwrapped instruments, or we misuse the term immediate use steam sterilization, IUSS. We used to call that flash sterilization. That's meant when you have maybe a specialty instrument, or you only have one of this particular type of instrument, and somehow it would get dropped or it got contaminated, and you would need to run a quick unwrap cycle. it would be delivered aseptically immediately from the sterilizer to the treatment room. Those instruments cannot be stored because they cannot maintain the sterility of the device. Best practices. When I talked about the 2 layers of wrap with CSR, with surgical wrap, you have choices of how you do the wrapping. You can do it sequentially, which you think of it as sort of a gift within a gift wrap. So you'll wrap the first time and you'll put the tape on, you'll put the box back on the second piece of paper, and you'll wrap identically with that second piece of paper. The fold that we see most often used in dentistry is the envelope fold, and you can Google this on the internet and you can see the different wrapping techniques, but we tend to go with the envelope fold, and we also tend to go with the second method, which is simultaneous double wrapping. So you'll put 2 pieces of wrap down together and then you'll wrap it as one, but you will have the double wrap to be in compliance with the validation and testing materials, both from the FDA, CDC, as well as AAMI. And the second wrap that's sometimes done is called the parcel or the package wrap, and it's more of a squared method as opposed to the peaked envelope method of folding. Here's the one. This is the, the million-dollar question. Common practices: placing instrument pouches flat or horizontally on the sterilizer tray. Obviously, the sterilizer on the left-hand side is overloaded because there's no way those pouches could expand. Best practice with pouches as well as cassettes is to load them vertically on their side like books on a shelf. With the pouches, you'll need to use a rack to be able to hold them up vertically, and when you look at the picture on the left, you'll note that there's space in between each one so that the steam as well as the heat, when it's drying, can circulate to totally expose that particular pack of instruments. I also show you a couple other options. If you are an office that chooses to do and maintain common practice and you're going to stay with horizontal loading, you need to follow your sterilizer manufacturer's instructions for use. The vast majority of the sterilizer manufacturers are now saying paper side down and plastic side up. There is one manufacturer that is still saying paper side up. If you are loading horizontally, they have to be in a single layer. They should not be overlapped or touching. If you are using cassettes and pouches and you want to put a cassette in horizontally, that cassette has to be by itself. You cannot stack a smaller cassette on top of it, nor can you put instrument pouches on top of a wrapped cassette. Again, best practice would be like you would see on that middle picture, turning it up on edge and loading them vertically, and you'll see again space in between. You don't want to pack them tight like books on a shelf. A couple other things with pouches. There has been a big movement within CDC compliance for what we are writing on our pouches and packages. You want to make sure that you have the date that the item was sterilized. Obviously, if you need to do a recall, you need to know what date that instrument pouch was sterilized. A cycle or load number so that you can identify specifically. If you are not using a pouch that you can see through, if you have a cassette with surgical wrap, you might want to write on the tape that you're closing it with what type of instrument is in there. You do not want to write on the surgical wrap itself. You can write on the tape, but not on the blue surgical wrap. You also have to decide whose initials go on it. Is the person who packed the pouch or the package, or is it the person who sterilized the pouch or the package? That needs to be in your protocol. Last but not least, your sterilizer serial number, especially if you have multiple sterilizers. If you have 2 mid-mark units and all you write is mid-mark, you don't know which one it was, and you have a failed BI and you have to go back and pull the instruments, if you don't have that serial number, you don't know which one it was. Common practice number 6, selecting the fastest cycle on the sterilizer for processing all the loads. This is sort of what I was talking about of the misuse with the immediate use steam sterilization, that you're doing your instruments unwrapped, and I mean, I even had an office who said we unwrap them, but then we put them into pouches before we deliver them. Once you've touched them, those items are no longer sterile, and that would be considered off-label use of the sterilization pouch. So you want to make sure that you are following your instrument manufacturer, your sterilizer manufacturer's instructions for use for the appropriate cycle parameters, meaning time, temperature, pressure, as well as dry time. If you have an older, maybe you have an older, like I said, a workhorse unit, and some of those IFUs aren't as detailed, I would encourage you to contact the manufacturer and ask them for updated IFUs. You can usually call the quality assurance department. Sometimes even customer service can help you with that. We just talked about sterilizer parameters can vary from manufacturer to manufacturer. You need to know what each one of your cycles, what are the time, temperature, and pressure to make sure that it correlates with the instruments that you're putting in there. Heavier instruments may have a very different cycle process required than some of our lighter, finer instruments. Or if you're doing instruments that are hollow, that have lumens, that's going to have a very different processing time as well. Okay, we're rounding the corner and we're on to common practice number 7. Removing packages from the sterilizer that are visibly wet. Wet is wet. It's not kind of wet. It's not just a little wet. If it's wet, it's not dry. And so you should not touch any instrument pouch or package that is damp, visibly wet, because there is the chance that whatever on your hands or on the countertop that you might set it on, those fibers are still wet and they're separated, and you can have wicking or a transfer of the contamination from your hand or the countertop into the sterilization pack. So these packs, if they are in fact wet, are considered to be contaminated, which means they either need to stay inside the sterilizer until they're completely dry, or they need to be repackaged and redone. So you need to make sure, if you have consistent issues with wet packs, you've got to look into what's causing it. The number one things that we see that's causing wet packs is overloading the sterilizer. You're putting far too much weight or mass of instruments in the sterilizer, or it's not being loaded correctly, and the steam and the dry air can't circulate appropriately. This is obviously considered an off-label use. You cannot use a fan to dry the pouches. That's not an appropriate method of getting them to dry more quickly. The other thing you want to make sure, besides loading appropriately and not overloading, is that you are not putting wet instruments into your pouch or wet instruments into your cassettes and then wrapping them. Because if you put 7 instrument pouches in your sterilizer that still have wet instruments, or if you run your cycle so tight back to back that the tray itself in your sterilizer is still wet, you've actually increased the volume of water in the sterilizer, and your dryer is set, it's calibrated to a specific volume of water, and if you've added more water in, that could be causing part of the problem with the wet packs. Common practice number 8, storing supplies and or sterile packages near sinks, in cardboard boxes, or in high traffic areas. We need to store our clean, sterile packages in a separate, environmentally controlled area away from sinks, floors, walls, and ceilings so that we don't get any potential contamination. Actually, shelves with a closed door are the best to use because it's easier for us to access, that we don't have to rummage around to find them. A lot of times in dentistry, we love drawers because drawers we think are organized, but every time you open and close a drawer that has the paper instrument packaging, you could be compromising the integrity of that packaging and causing tiny rips, tears, or holes. So drawers should be avoided. We also need to make sure these areas are kept dust-free and require frequent cleaning inside those cabinets. So we talked about a dry, clean environment, a controlled environment. You want to make sure that your instruments are being stored 8 to 10 inches from the floor, at least 5 inches from the ceiling, at least 18 inches from the ceiling if you happen to have a sprinkler head there. It also has to be 2 inches away from the outside walls. And if you are using some type of a wire rack to store your instruments on, that very bottom shelf needs to have a solid base so that you don't get cross-contamination from housekeeping issues. We should be in a temperate environment, like most of our offices are kept, between 64 and 72 degrees. Humidity is a big deal with sterilization products. 50% is considered ideal, but you see the range that's listed there. We talked a little bit about improper storage and use of cardboard boxes. And cardboard boxes, outside shipping containers, should not be used, never be used as containers for sterile storage. Obviously, you don't know how that cardboard box has been treated. In reality, a lot of these corrugated cardboard boxes are actually pretty filthy. All of those little channels in that paper, it's meant to give it added strength, but that's another place for all kinds of little critters and dust to sort of take hold. So we do not want to use any type of outer storage boxes. They should be disassembled, and whatever products came in them, you can use the inner storage boxes, but you cannot use the outer storage boxes. When we do store, we said that it's better to have them in a cabinet. If you're using cassettes, please store your cassettes up on edge so that when you go to remove them, you're not pulling one out that's underneath two other ones, because there's too much weight and you could end up tearing the paper. You also want to abide by a stock rotation principle that's going to be based on your sterilization date. So it's the first in, first out. So if I had an instrument package that I put in on October 1st, and I had another one in there that went on October the 12th, I'm going to use the October 1st one to keep my instrument rotation going. This could be a course all in and of itself, has to do with expiration dating, and I'm not going to spend a great deal of time talking about event-related sterility compared to time-related. Basically, we're on event-related sterility. However, you need to be cognizant, you need to be aware of your manufacturer's instructions for use on the expiration of the materials themselves. You'll find that sterilization pouches have a 1 to 3 year, what they call shelf life. This means when it's not being used. So if I had a box of pouches that expired on October the 31st, I could use those pouches tomorrow and Wednesday, and I could then put them up on my shelf to use for my rotation after they were sterilized for up to 3 years. However, if there's still unused bags in that box on November the 1st, that's considered an expired product. And again, because this is an FDA medical device, you would have to dispose of the expired product. You could not use those outdated products. If you take products out that do have expiration dates, if you take them out of their original packaging that would have their lot numbers and their expiration date, you need to have some sort of method to be able to identify what lot and expiration date are currently in your storage containers in case there's a recall. If you've thrown away the storage box, you're not going to know which is which. Common practice number 9, biological testing of sterilizers only done once a month or quarterly. We know that our CDC guidelines in dentistry say that we need to be testing our sterilizers, spore testing, at least weekly. That at least weekly, the other implication is for times that, let's say that you changed from using one manufacturer's sterilizer pouch to a different sterilizer pouch, you would need to run a BI. If you went from putting your cassettes in pouches to now putting them in sterilization wrap, you need to run a BI that first time. If you're going to do best practice and use the 2 wrap, but you've only been using 1 wrap until now, you need to run a BI. If your sterilizer has gone out for maintenance or repair, and when it's brought back, you need to run a BI. If you rearrange your reprocessing center so that you have that one-directional workflow, and you move the sterilizer from one part of the counter to the other part of the counter, you physically picked up the sterilizer or scooted it, you need to run a BI. The other thing that we see that sometimes is common practice is after an office has had a consecutive failure, a BI. So they sent a test in from October the 1st, and they found out that that test failed. So then they did their immediate retest, and that second test failed. If that happens, you are required to do 3 sequential BI tests. So it means that you put in one spore strip and you run the cycle. You put in another spore strip and you run another cycle. You put in the third spore strip and you run another cycle. You can't put 3 spore strips into one cycle and run it. And remember, when you're working with tabletop sterilizer, best practice is you run it with a full load. Your BIs should not be run on an empty load with the tabletop sterilizer. That's very different from some of the larger wall sterilizers that are in fact run empty. Another best practice, while it's not mentioned in the CDC guidelines, using a type 5 indicator when you're using your spore test, you can get immediate feedback from that type 5 integrating indicator. So it's a good idea to pair those 2 items together when you're testing your sterilizer. The type 5 doesn't replace, but it's going to give you that immediate feedback without incubation. You have a choice between mail-in or in-office, whatever works best in your practice, in your hands. The CDC acknowledges both. You just need to remember that if you're doing in-office, you're going to be responsible for all of the documentation and also for the testing methodology. So you want to make sure that you are reading how those need to be done. Interesting thing, when people are doing the in-office testing, I've seen it where they have sterilized the self-contained vial and they take it out and they put it in the crusher unit to crush that ampule and release the fluid, and then I see them shake it. You do not want to shake after you have crushed the vial because that lid on the top is vented and you don't want to take a chance of cross-contamination from that filter paper that's on the lid. You can tap it vertically upside down if you need to get it to saturate the disc or the strip a little bit better, or you can flick the bottom with your finger. You just can't shake it. Not best practice. When we talk about BI failures, the number one reason is demonstrated in both of those sterilizers. Overloading a sterilizer, you're going to have a failed BI for certain. That's the number one reason that spore tests failed. Either you've overloaded or you've not loaded appropriately. So user error comes into place. And you need to make sure that you're doing your decision tree when you had a failure. What could have been the things that possibly have gone wrong? Correct that and then do the retest. If the retest fails, you can go ahead and use the sterilizer again. If not, you've got that 3rd time's a charm technique to do. Finally, we're at number 10. 10th common practice is running the biological indicator on the empty sterilizer. And I sort of addressed that a little bit early. And you'll see in these pictures that they've actually put the biological indicator, the strip one on the top, the self-contained vial on the bottom picture, they put it into a pouch. You have the choice. The manufacturers, you can do it with or without. A lot of people feel in their best practice in their offices that if they put their instruments into a pouch, then they should also put their biological indicators into a pouch because it's testing the same way. Again, not a CDC requirement, but just something to think about. If you've not seen a type 5 integrating indicator, it looks a little bit different from a regular chemical indicator because it has a chemical pellet usually that melts, and it's a moving technology across the front, almost like a thermometer, until it gets into the safe zone. And the reason these are used with biological indicators, or use them in between when you're doing your BIs. If you do a BI on Monday and you're not going to do another BI till the following Monday, using a type 5 integrator once a day in your sterilizer gives you that umbrella policy, that peace of mind that the sterilizer is functioning appropriately, because this is the closest thing you have to a biological indicator. It doesn't replace it because there's no viable organisms on there, but it reacts over the time of the cycle, not just at one specific point in time. Finally, after the 10 different best practice, common practice, current practice items, you have your quality assurance and your quality control. So as I said, we have 6 different steps of instrument processing that starts from transfer to cleaning to inspection to packaging, sterilization, and then of course handling and storage. You want to make sure that you have your policies and procedures written down so that you can use that document as part of your ongoing training, your training for new staff, as well as your annual retraining. If you've not taken a look at the CDC summary document and the check-off lists, the observational check-off list in the back, that's a great way, easy way to start to be able to be compliant with policies and procedures. Use your sales reps and use the customer service and the technical support staff that are available with a lot of the products to make sure that you understand how that product's meant to be used, how it's meant to be interpreted, you know, what are the limitations, the expiration dates of the product as well. You want to make sure that you're using the right disposable products to go with the right packaging. You know, you can use aluminum foil in a dry heat sterilizer, but you can't use it in a steam sterilizer. You can use regular paper in a steam sterilizer, but you can't put it in a dry heat sterilizer that goes to 420 degrees because it'll burn up. So make sure it's apples and apples. And the other thing is, and I know the word supervision sometimes can be intimidating, but sort of have each other's backs and make sure that everybody is consistently doing things the way you've set it up in your practice, that you don't have a lot of tribal practices going on, because that's where you start falling out of compliance within your practice. We've got right about 8 minutes left, and I thank you very much for your time, and Crosstex is committed to being a support for you, not just today, but if you have other additional questions about infection control or about sterility assurance, I'm happy to serve as a resource for you. So you have my email address and you have a phone number that you can reach me as well. So if it appears we have a few questions that I'm going to click on and see what, let's see, use Clorox wipes. There's a question about using a particular brand manufacturer disinfecting wipes, surface disinfecting wipes on non-critical instruments. My assumption, Lindsay, is that, I'm sorry, Susan, is that you're talking about wipes that you buy in a regular store. You cannot use common household product wipes to even wipe down semi-critical instruments. You need to use, they're a medical device, so you have to use the appropriate, so you cannot use a household product. But thank you very much for the question. What is the latest recommendation for barriers? Deanna, I'm not sure if you mean, I'm not sure exactly what you mean for barriers. Barriers are very much an accepted method to use on surfaces that are full of nooks and crannies and are very difficult to be able to efficiently and effectively surface disinfect. They need to be removed after each use. And your question is versus just wiping. When they have to be replaced after each one. If there's been any contamination underneath the barrier, then you would have to do another spray wipe spray or wipe discard wipe to be in compliance with the barrier use. You already said, but could you repeat where to get the summary? Oh, okay. Gary asked about getting the CDC summary document. The easiest place, you can go to the CDC website. But you can also very easily go to OSAP as in Paul, the Organization for Safety, Asepsis, and Prevention.org. And if you go to, I think it's Knowledge Center, and you'll see CDC document. You can download the entire document. You can also download just the checklist forms, and you can also upload a user-friendly checklist form that if you have a tablet or an iPad, you can actually enter data directly from your tablet or iPad. So thanks, Gary. I'm looking through. Okay. Melissa, you're asking about buying the racks for the instruments so that you can put them vertically on a rack. There is an original equipment manufacturer from every sterilizer manufacturer, but you can also post-market. They're available if you talk to your dental dealer. There will be different sizes and configurations that you can then just set on the tray that's in your sterilizer. The one point that I didn't mention is you want to make sure when you're using the rack that your pouches are all facing the same way, like all plastic forward or all paper forward. You don't want a paperback to a paperback touching because it's like putting two pieces of wet glass together. Okay. What methods of cleaning the cassette prior to sterilization are permissible if they don't fit in the ultrasonic? Well, I'm going to say that acronym I've been saying all night, and that is you're going to have to go back to your cassette manufacturer IFU because they will have the specific maintenance. It will also tell you what detergents, if any, can be used on there. So you want to go to your specific manufacturer for your cassette. Okay, Sandra, you had a question about how long are instruments considered to be sterile. That's that age-old question of event-related sterility versus time-related. It used to be that, and there are still some hospitals or community health centers that rotate their instruments every 6 months. That's just a policy they have within their practice. But what's more generally accepted is event-related sterility. And that would be that once a package has been sterilized and stored appropriately and rotated appropriately, as long as the packaging is not compromised, it didn't become punctured, torn, wet, mildewed, cracked, like the plastic cracked, then it's considered to still be sterile. That's called event-related sterility. But then you've really got to have the people that are using the instrument pouches inspecting them before they open and release to the patient. What happens if there's a difficulty getting an IFU? The company we order from has yet to provide them for me. Okay, so you're struggling to get the IFUs, and I will tell you that a lot of manufacturers are now, like we put them online. So if you go to websites and you go to the specific product, sometimes if you look at the bottom, it'll say like technical documents. And the IFUs and the SDS, the safety data sheets, are often downloadable online. If you're having trouble getting them from a request, I would suggest going to either the quality assurance or the regulatory department, because those are the folks that are going to be responsible, and they would be the go-to for those particular documents. But again, a lot of them are online. To clean the cement. Okay. There's a question about sterilization disinfection. Again, critical instruments must be heat sterilized, but they must be cleaned of any organic or restorative debris, blood, tissue, etc., before you put them in to be sterilized. If you put them in the sterilizer and there's still debris on, you're going to bake it on there. So they do need to be cleaned efficiently, either with an ultrasonic unit, a washer disinfector. If you take instruments out and there's still residual debris, that might be the one time that you're going to want to use a manual scrub. And an important step I'd like to share to be within CDC guidelines, if you must hand scrub an individual instrument, and notice I said individual, you should never have multiple instruments in your hand when you're doing a hand scrub. You want to make sure, first of all, that you have the appropriate PPE. So that's going to be a heavy-duty, puncture-resistant, chemical-resistant glove. Not the ones that you're going to find in the grocery store for washing dishes, but these are ones that you're going to buy from your dental distributor. You also want to make sure that you have glasses and a mask on because you're going to be generating aerosols. When you do this, it is suggested that you fill your sink half full of water. You'll then hold the instrument in your non-dominant hand, submerge it under the water. Don't put it under the faucet with the water running and start to scrub because you're creating more of an aerosol. By submerging it underwater, you're reducing the aerosol contamination, and also if you should drop it, that way it's not going to bounce anywhere and cause an accidental injury. It's just going to go to the bottom of the sink. All right, and I believe that we are, oops, there's another one, just a second. Okay. There's a question about when I mentioned the option of a washer or a washer disinfector. An instrument washer is going to run a cycle that essentially the instruments are going to be rinsed, they're going to be washed, they're going to be rinsed again, and they're going to be dried so that they're going to make them ready to be packaged to be sterilized. There are also instrument washer disinfectors that actually have an additional high thermal cycle that is considered to be a disinfecting cycle. Now, this is not the disinfecting that you can then put them in a package and use them again for patient care. It's just disinfecting to make them safer for handling. So again, it's only, they either wash or they wash disinfect with the thermal cycle. There are now tabletop units that are available, so it's becoming much more fiscally available to us, that we're not buying the large, the large unit that looks like a regular dishwasher, but they're actually tabletop units. And with that, I'm seeing the red light flashing. I would also like to share one little bit more news, that we are going to be doing another live webinar on November the 13th. And the exciting thing about this is it's going to be our first preventive dentistry webinar. And so it's going to be called, and I'm drawing a blank, just a second. It's called Preventive Measures, the Science of Essential Selective Polishing. And so this is our first time to sort of venture out of infection control. So we've got a lot of loyal followers. We really appreciate your time, and we hope that you'll join us on Tuesday the 13th. Thank you so much for spending your evening with me. If I can be of any future help, please do call, cross-text, or you have my email. Thanks again for your time tonight.